Hello everybody and welcome to our first video in our series of videos on the famine from 1845 to 1851. Today we are going to look at life in Ireland before the famine and some of the causes of the famine. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes, so by the end of this presentation you should know the different groups of people who lived on the land at the time of the famine. You should know 2 facts about a workhouse, and you should know 4 causes of the Great Famine. So what did Ireland look like before the famine? One of the big things about Ireland was that it experienced a massive population growth between 1801 and 1841. So the population at 1801 was 5 million, in 1841 it was 8.2 million. If you look at today's population of this industrialized country, the population of the Republic of Ireland is about 4.7 million. The population of Northern Ireland is about 1.8 million. So that's a total of about 6.5 million on this whole island. So it was substantially more than we have now. So this was a growth between 1801 and 1841 of 3.2 million people. The majority of these people lived in the countryside. Only 3 cities had populations bigger than 50,000: Dublin, Cork, and Belfast. 50,000 today would be a town, with the suburbs around it. So that there were only 3 cities with a population of bigger than 50,000 shows that the vast majority of these 8.2 million people lived in the countryside. And if you live in the countryside, there is very limited work other than work on the land. So who were all these people who lived in the countryside? The first group we look at are the landlords. So there were about 20,000 large landlords who owned most of the land in Ireland. These guys could have estates from 70,000 acres to 80,000 acres, but the majority will be about 2,000 to 4,000 kind of acres. To give you an idea of how much an acre is, it's about the size of a soccer field. A soccer field is just over an acre. So if you have an estate of 70,000, that is 70,000 soccer fields. Okay. A lot of these landlords would have been what we would call an absentee landlord. They would have lived in Dublin, or they would have lived over in England, and they would have had an agent to take care of their affairs. They would have no idea about what was happening on the land, who their tenants were. They wouldn't have cared who they were. Not all of them were absentee landlords. Some of them did live on the land, and they would usually live in a country house known as the big house. So everyone in the locality would call this the big house because this was where kind of the boss was, the rich landlord would be. An example of a house in your locality that would look like the big house would be Wells House. If any of you have been there, that kind of thing, a big estate, something like that. Now, sometimes landlords would work through middlemen. So the estates were so large that they'd sometimes employed these middlemen. And the middlemen would offer to pay them a certain amount for land, and then they would sublet it to kind of tenant farmers. The middleman is always going to try to get as much money from the people he is rented to as possible. He's always going to try to maximize his profits. So he has a fixed price with the landlord, and then he's trying to get as much money out of the tenant farmers as he's like. There are no rights movements at the time. There's no rights groups. So what he says you have to pay, you have to pay. Otherwise, you have to find somewhere else to support your family. So he would rent to people that are called tenant farmers. And again, these are broke up into 2 groups. You had large farmers and you had small farmers. The large farmers were generally quite well off. They would have land with about 30 acres or more. They'd have enough land and enough money they could hire labourers to help them. They lived quite comfortably in 2-story houses, and their children would usually receive an education of some sort. Other than them, we would have the small farmers, and these people would subsist on lands that were 30 acres to 5 acres, somewhere in between there. They would usually live in small kind of thatched cottages. They would grow wheat and barley, these crops, and they would sell them on, and that's how they would pay their rent. And then they would grow potatoes as their source of food. The next kind of group of people we look at are the Cottiers. So the Cottiers would rent a small plot of land from a tenant farmer, usually an acre. This was known as a con acre. Um, so what they would do is they would work for the tenant farmer as a labourer, help him in any jobs he needed done around the farm, and then he'd have his own plot of land where he could grow his own food to support himself and his family. Finally, we had the landless labourers. These were the most vulnerable of people, and when the Great Famine comes, these are the people who are going to be hit first. They would have no work in winter. Sometimes they would rent rooms in a lodging house, or they'd live in mud cabins outside of the town, and pick up work whenever they could. Some of them travelled around and they'd go around looking for work, and these people were called spalpeens. So just to kind of give you a visual on how this system worked, you'd have the landlord on top. He might rent to the middleman. The middleman would then divide the land up, and he would have large tenants or small tenant farmers. The large tenant farmer then would sometimes he could employ a cottier, so he'd give him an acre or a con acre of land. He could maybe get in some spalpeens for some seasonal work, or some landless labourers for some seasonal work. Small tenant farmers could sometimes employ spalpeens or landless labourers as well. They usually wouldn't employ cottiers because to give up an acre of land would be a lot for them. So again, just to give you a visual, so imagine this is the landlord's land. What will happen then is he is going to rent it out to some large tenant farmers, and they will get these kind of big fields and estates, as you can see here. Then what happens is they would rent it out to these smaller plots of land to small tenants, and that would be the way it would be set up. Also, a large tenant then might give a little bit of land here to a cottier. So that should give us an idea of kind of the people who lived on the land and how they lived. What we're going to move on to now is we're going to look at the workhouses and poverty. So even before the famine, Ireland was a desperately poor country. We talked about the three cities of Belfast, Cork and Dublin, and Belfast was really the only one of these that had any kind of industry. You would have studied the Industrial Revolution, and Dublin and Cork would have been very far behind in the Industrial Revolution at this time, whereas Belfast mainly traded with Britain, so its markets were in Britain, so it became industrialised a bit quicker. They reckon 7 out of 10 families didn't have enough food. Like 70% of the population did not have enough food. This led to 1.5 million Irish people emigrating even before the famine. So if you take that 1.5 million people along with the 8.2 million people, that is a lot of Irish people. And another thing is the potato crop had failed many times before the Great Famine. There were many years where the potato crop rotted and it didn't work in the 1820s and the 1830s. So this great potato famine, it didn't come out of nowhere. There had been warnings all along. One of the ways that they tried to deal with this poverty was to set up this thing called the Poor Laws in 1838. If you remember from your 1798 rebellion, after the 1798 rebellion, there was a thing called the Act of Parliament, or the Act of Union. Sorry, the Act of Union. Act of Parliament is a different thing. The Act of Union was set up in 1801, where Ireland no longer had their own government. So any decisions about Ireland were made in London, in Westminster. So in 1838, they brought in this poor law thing. They set up 130 of these workhouses. So the workhouses were established in 1838 under the poor law. The first ones were opened in 1841. They were horrific places. They made conditions deliberately terrible to discourage anybody from going there. They did not want people taking advantage of this. The people who would usually go there would be people whose maybe were evicted from their farm. Maybe their potato crop failed. As I said, it had failed many times before this. And when you went there, you were separated out from your family. Fathers went one place, children went one place, mothers went another place, and they would be kept in separate places and wouldn't get to see each other. The work there was terrible, of absolutely no meaning at all. They didn't want the workhouses to stop compete with any of the local industries, so they might do stuff like breaking rocks for roads, grinding corn sometimes, but nothing that would give any kind of self-worth to anybody. So now we're going to move on to the causes of the famine. We usually have four main causes of the famine. We go with the rise in population, the subdivision of land, over-dependence on the potato, and the actual potato blight. So the rise in population. So as the population grew, people became poorer. We talked about how big that rise was, but as it grew, people became poorer. There was less land and less food to go around. The next thing we look at is subdivision. So if we take our example of what farmers, landlords' plot of land might look like, what happened was small farmers would want to leave land to their sons. They would want to give land as a dairy for their daughters. So as they did this, their plots of land became smaller, as you can see here. So the land gets divided and divided. And as the farms became smaller, the farmers became poorer. The next thing we talk about is the over-dependence on the potato. Again, linking back in, if you remember from your age of exploration, one of the big things that happened with the age of exploration was that all this nutritious food came over from South America. We talked about the population growth in Ireland. The potato is a big reason for this population growth. Throughout Europe at this time, as Europe is becoming the most powerful continent on the planet, it is because they are able to feed people with foods like potatoes, which are nutritious and they're full of vitamin C, things that people need to keep themselves alive. The men in Ireland ate up to 5 to 6 kilos of potatoes a day. If you go to a supermarket and you look at how big a 5 kilo bag of potatoes is, you will be surprised at how many potatoes that actually is. They ate them for breakfast, for dinner, and for supper. Another reason that the potato was so popular is that in a small plot of land you could get a lot of food that would feed a family. The final cause of the famine was the blight. This is a disease that attacks and it rots potatoes. The potato might look fine on the inside, but when you open it up, it's all a mush, and if you try to eat it, you will vomit. So the food becomes completely inedible. We will look further at these causes in relation to the famine next time, but just to recap, what you should have gotten from this video is you should know the different groups of people who lived on the land at the time of the famine. So we had the landlords, the middlemen, the large tenant farmers, small tenant farmers, your cottiers, your spalpeens, your landless labourers. You should know 2 facts about a workhouse. So for example, that families were divided when they went in. The work was quite meaningless. It was set up from the poor laws, and it was deliberately a horrible place to discourage people from going there. And then you should know your 4 causes of the Great Famine. So again, we had the rise in population, we had the subdivision of land, the over-dependence on the potato, and the potato blight. So hope you guys have got some good information from this. Thanks for watching.